Hello, everyone. This is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of 55 plus training sessions that will help you and your team avoid fraud, compliance fines, and bad vendor data. Or just sign up to get access to vendor process FAQs and to attend weekly drop-in live Q&A sessions. Visit training.deborahrrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. When it comes to vendor validations, are you performing enough? Too many? Too often? How do you know for sure? And how do you get customized vendor validations recommended specifically for your company? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 249. Are you performing too many vendor validations too often? And I specifically worded the title of the podcast episode that way because I really typically do not get that question about doing too many and too often. However, in the last week, I've had multiple people reach out, either subscribers or listeners or people that come to my site and throw a question in the chat area, or will now submit, because I have a new Ask the Expert link on my Vendor Process Training Center, and I get questions through there now as well. But I usually never get a question that asks if they're doing too many or doing it too often. And one person specifically said that they thought it might be overkill. It does bring up a point that vendor team members may be out there, maybe even you, thinking that you're doing too much. But again, this was a little bit different than what I normally get. Normally, I get folks that reach out and say, hey, I don't know what vendor validations I should be doing. Should I be doing this? Should I be, doing an IRS 10 match for everyone, or only the reportable ones, or only when we get close to, the tax year? And so usually those are the ones that I get. I never have gotten anyone that says they thought they were doing too many and then revalidating them like too often. So I thought this would be a good topic for this podcast. And if you are one of the ones that are asking or have asked or want to ask what vendor validations you should be doing specific to your company, then make sure that you listen all the way to the end, because I'll show you how you can get that answer, and it might be free. So let me just start off by saying, and those of you that have regularly listened to my podcast, you already know what my answer is going to be. It is never overkill, right? You are never performing too many vendor validations, and you are never validating too often. However, you can, because it won't hurt the more you do it, it will not hurt. It'll only ensure that you have accurate vendor data and that you are, protecting your company against any compliance fines that comes from not validating as often as you should. And that's specifically or especially true for the sanctions list and the watch list, because those things aren't static. So if you do it at vendor onboarding, then, the next day they could have been added to one of to the watch list that you just checked. So nothing is too much. But in any event, let's kind of break that down, and I'm going to break it down based on when you typically do validations, and that is in really 3 steps. 1, at vendor onboarding. 2, when the vendor requests a change to their information. And 3, when you're doing regular maintenance of your vendor master file. I call it a vendor master file cleanup. And I do have an episode on it's time to clean your vendor master file, updated for 2022, and it's still valid for now. So take a listen to that. It's episode 208. And then I just found that I also did episode 217, where I talk about vendor master file cleanup tools to help make your life easier. Because I know that process is really, for most of us, very manual. Even if you have an accounting system or ERP that will, inactivate vendors for you, other parts of that process is still manual. So listen to episode 208 to get the 8 steps. And then listen to episode 217 for tools that can help you with that process. Let's start with vendor validations at vendor setup. So when you're adding a new vendor. Now, when you're adding a new vendor, you need to make sure that the vendor is real. You also need to make sure that whatever payments you send to the vendor will actually get to the vendor. And you also need to make sure that you are complying with regulatory requirements surrounding collecting, for example, the IRS tax ID where it is required to be collected, and then also checking them against watch lists. Now, some of you may also have other required documents that you must collect, like the insurance document. And so if that's you, then you need to make sure that you add that. So with that being said, when you set that vendor up, you need to make sure that you are validating whatever registration number they give you, be it the U.S. Tax ID or maybe other registration numbers for other countries. You also need to make sure you are validating the address. So especially if you are sending a check, because you want that to get there and not to come back to you. So you need to make sure that you are validating that it's correct. And also that is another way to make sure, along with the collecting a vendor registration number, making sure your vendor is real. And I've told this story before. When I was a practitioner, I was a manager. One of my vendor team members was a little suspicious about an address, so they put it into Google Earth, and it came out to be a parking lot next to a liquor store. And so you do need to make sure that that is valid, and that it is not any suspicion surrounding it. So you want to make sure that if it's a check, it'll get there, and that it's a real vendor and not fraudulent. And then if you are paying by ACH or wire, you first need to verify that the payment will be successful. So you either need to do something like a penny test or a pre-note, or if you have access to validate vendor bank account ownership, where you are verifying that the legal name of the vendor matches the bank account holder's name. And then in some cases, verifying that the tax ID that you have for the vendor matches the tax ID that was used to set up the bank account, then that's even better. And some of those are a little hit and miss because some vendors do not have a bank account that reflects their name, because it could be the parent company, and then that means that you won't have a hit. And then there's some other reasons that you might not have a successful validation when you're doing bank account ownership. And I did do an episode on that as well. I gave some reasons why that validation may not be successful, and that is episode 205. And I had one possible reason: your match rates may be lower than expected for bank account ownership validations. I thought I gave more reasons than that, but check it out if you are interested. So that is at onboarding. You do need to determine what validations you need to do to make sure you are compliant with regulatory organizations such as the IRS, OFAC, other watch lists that are that pertain to your company or your vendor's country. And then you also need to make sure that that information is accurate, because you want to make sure that any payments that go out won't come back, they won't fail. And overall, you need to make sure that that vendor is not a fraudulent vendor and that their information and they are real. So that's what you're doing at vendor setup when you're adding a vendor. Now, the next step when you're doing vendor validations is when a vendor updates their information. And so I know many of you may only validate what is being updated, and maybe there's no validations at all if all the vendor is doing is for example, is updating their email address. But I challenge you here, because this is an opportune time to do your revalidations, the exact same ones that were done when you onboarded the vendor, to make sure nothing has changed. It's an excellent time to, perform those validations again, because if for some reason a fraudster is trying to, for example, change that email address so that when they send the second fraudulent email, the next level, that's going to ask you to change your banking, right? Or that's going to ask to change something that's related to communicating with them, so that when they do ask you to change their banking or maybe their remit address to divert checks, because check fraud is growing, that you're going to end up reaching out to them and not the vendor. And so what I typically recommend, and what I used to require as a practitioner, is when you touch a vendor record, then you need to make sure you revalidate everything on that vendor record. And so that is back to the tax ID or whatever registration number is valid for the vendor's country. You're revalidating the addresses. You are revalidating the information for any banking details that you have collected. And if you think about it, on the banking details side, there could be, for example, a change to the routing numbers. Because banks merge and get acquired all the time, and vendors don't necessarily tell you that. And so it's best practice to always check that. Now, you'll find it out, right, if you continue to send or include the wrong routing numbers in your pay files. You're going to end up getting notices of change, meaning the banks may have changed that for you so the payment can be successful, but they're not going to do it for forever. And so they could report you to NACHA, who oversees and governs the ACH network. And so you want to make sure you're not sending bad information in a pay file. Also, they could just fail your payment as well. And so at some point you may have to deal with it. So you do want to make sure that you're checking that information again in case something has changed. And I said mergers and acquisitions, but it could also be because banks have failed or closed, right? We had 2 examples of that this year with, was it Signature Valley Bank and Silicon Bank, or Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank? But we had 2 examples of that. And so typically, based on the progress of, selling that bank to someone else in between, right? They may change the routing number and have or let the vendor retain their account number. And so again, the vendor may not know that they need to reach out to you. So in any event, you need to check that too. Plus anything else that you are validating as part of, what your company, and it could be unique, needs to validate or collect. So in essence, you're actually doing the same validations that you do for a vendor ad. So I guess now for sure you know what my answer is as to, whether or not they're doing vendor validations too often. All right, so the third step where you could be performing vendor validations is when you are cleaning your vendor master file. Now, part of cleaning the vendor master file is inactivating vendors you haven't done business with. And you always want to do that first so you can just inactivate them and then not have to worry about them for the rest of the steps. But the rest of the steps, you got it, includes revalidating that information. And if you think about it, for those vendors that did not have a change that triggered the update or the revalidation of all their information at some point between the last time you clean your vendor master file and now, they're just now getting to having that information revalidated. And so you do need to do that. And one thing I forgot to mention with the addresses is that addresses, they do have a status attached to them, right? They can be mailable, they can be vacant, they can be inactive. And so that can change from the first time that you onboard the vendor or when you check them last. And one thing I didn't really realize is that anyone can inactivate their address with the postal service because they just don't want to receive email or mail anymore. I don't know that a vendor would do that if they've got checks coming to that address, but it's possible. And it's also possible that you may have had a vendor that may have moved and they sent the change of address request to your internal team member that they have a relationship with, and that internal team member did not send it to you. So you didn't get it. And guess what? If the post office sends mail or delivers mail to an address and they find out that after a certain period of time, I think it's 90 days, that mail is not being picked up, so they just keep piling mail into the mailbox, they're going to take that mail, or the delivery person is going to take that mail back to the post office, and the post office is going to designate that address as vacant. And so if you don't recheck that, then you're going to end up continuing to send, for example, checks or anything else, 1099s, to that address, and they're just going to keep piling up. And you would, I don't know at what point they start sending it back to you, but you at that point, you do need to make sure that you are that you're following up on it and getting that address change. But in the meantime, you could be sending, checks, 1099s before it even gets to that point where it's going to be returned. And so you need to make sure that you're checking those. Now, as far as address status goes, the USPS, so United States Postal Service, actually does have that information. They just don't give it to you. There is a resource called smarty.com that does give you that information. And that resource, as well as other validations that you could be doing, it's a list of 16 vendor validations from 26 different resources. So you'll see the 26 different resources, and I think it's 28 now because I updated it. But the validations on that free vendor validation resource or reference list, that is always a link in the show notes. So check that out if you haven't already. But they're divided based on where you would get it from, like the IRS W-8 or W-9, or maybe the invoice, or maybe an email. And so check that out if you haven't. Now, as far as how often you perform the validation, so as step one, when you get a new vendor, right, you do your validations. Same with changes. When you receive a change request, you're going to do those validations. But cleaning your vendor master file, I get that question all the time. How often should you do it? And that is if you're doing it manually and you're doing your validations manually, my recommendation as a best practice is to perform that vendor master file cleanup on a monthly basis. But if you cannot do it on a monthly basis, then do it on a quarterly basis. Can't do it quarterly, do it twice a year, that's semi-annually. And if you can't do it semi-annually, at least do it once per year. Now, you might think, wow, that is a lot. And I know it's a lot. And again, I've said before, I know this process is very manual. But if you think about it in terms of the risks that you may be avoiding, the risks of fraud, the risks of fines resulting from, right, paying vendors that are on these watch lists because you didn't check them, after they were added, because, right, when you onboarded the vendor or changed them last, they were not on the list, but they haven't had any changes, and you space your vendor master file cleanups too far, right? And you ended up paying a vendor that was subsequently added to the list before you could identify them. And so I recommend that you do it monthly. Now, there are tools and companies, third-party providers out there, especially if you're looking at a vendor self-registration portal that will provide that validation. They will monitor, they will have continuous monitoring. And so that monitoring, it'll be, it won't cover all your validations, but you really need continuous monitoring, if only for the watch list, but they do vary in what validations they provide. So check them out, and then that way you won't have to worry about, maybe you can space out, the cleaning of your vendor master file a little longer than a month if you have continuous monitoring in place, either through a vendor self-registration portal or maybe through other tools or software providers. So make sure you check those out. So again, the answer to the question is, can you have too many validations? No. Can you validate too often or perform validations too often? The answer to that is absolutely not. I will say, though, that you might be doing validations that are not really specific or required for your specific company, right? Your industry, the type of vendors you have, the countries of the vendors that you have in your vendor master file, right? Each of those can drive which validations, which sanctions lists you check, right? Which validations you perform. And so you really do need to customize the validations that you are doing for your particular company. And one example I have is I had a person reach out and say that she was doing the IRS 10 match and then also doing checking against the Office of Inspector General, or OIG. They have, I think it's called the LEIE list, but it's an exclusion list for vendors that cannot receive Medicare and Medicaid funds. And she was doing that because when she was with a healthcare organization, right, they had to make sure they weren't paying vendors that were excluded from receiving Medicaid or Medicare payments. And so it was valid. But then when she left and went to a non-healthcare or a company that, weren't paying vendors with Medicaid or Medicare funds, it was no longer necessary to do. But it was continued to be done just because that's what, they thought needed or she thought needed to be done. But no, it can be different. It doesn't hurt to do it, but that's why I say you can't have too many. but you don't need to do certain validations, again, based on your company, your industry, vendor countries, type of vendors, and maybe even some other criteria. So with that, I do want to introduce really a new service this year that I have called Customized Vendor Validations. Now, there is a cost associated to it, but I will work with you to identify what vendor validations you actually need to do, and then I will give you desktop procedures that will show you and your whole team how to perform those recommended validations. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer, they are recommended validations. If there are other validations or watch lists that you need to check against that for some reason did not come out in the review process, that I can't be liable for. But what I will do or can do is give you the best recommendations along with instructions on how to do those that are recommended. And so I'll put a link to that page for customized vendor validations in the show notes. And here's the kicker. If you are a Vendor Process Training Pass member, which means you have access to take up to 56 different vendor process trainings, and that includes a 4-hour workshop, and it is recorded so you can watch it at your convenience. But it's a 4-hour workshop that gives you 5 authentication techniques, 27 internal controls, 17 best practices, and 16 vendor validations. It explains all of those. Not to mention that you also get 23 different vendor setup and maintenance templates. So it's things like a, substitute W8, W9, and that means it's a combined W9 or W8 along with your vendor setup form. So, you can reduce the number of forms you have to collect. It does include a banking form that has built-in authentication in it. It also has some templates for reference and documenting. So in addition to all of that you now also get to have a session to customize your vendor validations. And so that is included now with your vendor training pass. So if you're a training pass member, make sure you reach out with the link again in the show notes and schedule your customized vendor validation session. It's only 1 hour. You'll answer a questionnaire, and then I will once we meet, I will come back in probably about 48 hours and provide you a customized list of vendor validations that are recommended for your organization, along with desktop procedures to perform them. So if you've ever asked which validations should I be doing, whether you are a Vendor Process Training Pass member or not, you need to click on the link in the show notes and schedule your initial call. All right, so with that, I hope I answered the question about whether or not you could perform too many or too often, right, vendor validations. Many of you already knew my answer to that was it's not possible to do either of those. And I hope you agreed with my reasons why. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 249th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.